Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Defector, which is episode 10 of season 3 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls, or my Patreon user polls, I should say. The episode to win my latest Patreon user poll is The Defector. So The Defector is the episode in which the Enterprise encounters a Romulan defector who claims that the Romulans are planning a war against the Federation unless they act to stop them immediately by going into the neutral zone. Picard, of course, is hesitant, and the crew doesn't really trust Romulan, but then he proves himself to Data and then starts revealing vital information about the Romulans' weaknesses, and so the Enterprise goes into the neutral zone only to find the whole thing was a trap, that this particular Romulan was lied to and fed disinformation on the hopes, in order to test his loyalty, and on the hopes of luring the Enterprise into the neutral zone so the Romulans could capture it. However, Picard had a trick up his sleeve, and a couple of Klingon ships accompanied him to the neutral zone, which ambushed the Romulans, and so the Romulans let them return. However, the Defector himself, after feeling betrayed, committed suicide, but left a letter for his daughter in the hopes that one day the Picard and the Federation would be able to return this letter to his daughter. So, it's a really powerful episode. I always like this episode. Now, let me start by saying that I sometimes like doing themes for my Patreon polls, and the theme of this month's Patreon polls was great villain episodes. Now, I had to, of course, choose from episodes that I haven't reviewed already, but I chose one from each of the Star Trek series of what I thought illustrated a great villain. And for this, for Next Generation, I chose the Defector mainly because I was thinking of Tomalak as a great Star Trek villain rather than Q. Even though I did name Q in my villain video, I think of him as less of a villain, more of like a mischievous hindrance. When I think of villains in Next Gen, I think Tomalak, and I actually think this is Tomalak's best episode. Now, he doesn't appear that much in this episode. He does appear a lot more in the episode The Enemy, so I could have chosen The Enemy, and of course Future Imperfect is not really Tomalak, it's just a holographic imitation of him, and he only appears in All Good Things for like 2 seconds. But so I could have chosen The Enemy, but first of all, I don't think The Enemy is as good of an episode. And secondly, even though Tomalak appears more in The Enemy, I think he's a better villain in this episode. I think he's more menacing, and he is definitely more menacing, because The Enemy, he does threaten to attack the Enterprise, but he's kind of operating from a position of weakness, whereas in this episode, he is the mastermind that set this trap for Picard that worked. And so when he shows up with 2 Romulan warbirds that outmaneuver and outgun the Enterprise, and they seem the Enterprise is at their mercy, he has a lot more teeth. And it was a really, really great scene too, between Picard and Tomalak. Even though, again, he only appears in this one scene in the episode, it's just his appearance is so good. It does make me regret that they didn't bring this character back even more and make him a more reoccurring villain, which apparently, like, the show wanted to do, but the actor, after appearing in Future Imperfect, didn't want to do that, because in The Enemy and The Defector, he was just a talking head on the screen, but in Future Imperfect, he had to interact with the crew wearing heavy makeup, and he said he didn't like that, which is kind of doesn't make any sense, since he was a main cast member on Babylon 5, where he also wore heavy makeup, so I don't really get that statement, but whatever. Anyway, and he's such a good actor, though, too. I mean, he was so good. He was my favorite actor in Babylon 5, but anyway, Yeah, it's a shame they didn't have Tom Locke appear more, but I do love this episode for that one scene. Like, the interactions between Picard and Tom Locke was absolutely amazing. You know, the way that, you know, Picard's just like, okay, well, we'll just be on our way, and Tom Locke's like, what, not even an apology? And Picard's like, all right, well, if an apology will do, I offer one. He's like, well, I'm afraid it won't do, so I'll spare you the humiliation. Like, I love that back and forth. That interaction is absolutely amazing, and I love how he's like, and Tom Locke lays down the laws, like, I expect you to surrender your crew as prisoners of war, and surrender the traitor Admiral Giroc to me immediately, and I will take the Enterprise and display his broken hull when Romulus has assigned to all would-be traitors. And Picard's like, you don't really expect that I'll accept those terms, do you? And his reply is, no, Captain, I expect you won't. Like, genius. Like, this is, I would dare say, Gold Dukat level of brilliant villainies, or that adversarial interaction. The only reason why we think of Gold Dukat more highly than Tom Locke is because Gold Dukat appeared a hell of a lot more often than Tom Locke did. I reckon if Tom Locke did appear as often as Gold Dukat, we would also be holding him up as one of the great villains of Star Trek. So yeah, so that's why I chose this episode to represent Next Gen for the great villains. But even though that's not really the point of the episode, the point of the episode more is Admiral Giroc, the Defector, and who is also played by an amazing actor who does an amazing job. He's appeared in Star Trek many times after this. This was his first appearance. He also appeared in one of my favorite episodes of Voyager, Jetrel playing the title character in an amazing performance, and he also played Moore Pole in Deep Space Nine, which is Odo's like adoptive father, I guess. The scientist who discovered and studied and basically raised him. And he also did a great job in that. He also played a future version of Alexander at one stage as well. But he's a great performer. He always does a really good job whenever he appears. And I think it's definitely one of his best performances. I think so the concept of the episode is to have a Romulan defector, which would kind of make sense because the whole, and especially I noticed this a lot more going back and watching TNG, is that the relationship between the Federation, or the conflict, I should say, between the Federation and Romulans is very much reminiscent of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, the reason why that didn't come readily to mind, and that felt more like a revelation, is because I think of Star Trek doing analogies for the Cold War. I think of more of the original series and using the Klingons as a metaphor for the Soviet Union. And that's probably what would come to anyone's mind more when they think of Star Trek doing analogies for the Cold War. However, and I think of like, isn't like the Cold War by Next Generation time kind of not really a thing anymore? But actually, because I always think of Next Generation as more modern than it actually is, because it seems like it never seems as cheesy unless you watch like the first season, especially the episode Justice. But it never seems as cheesy as other stuff that came out around the same time. Like, I forget that this episode was the first episode of Next Generation to actually come out in the 90s. It came out in January of 1990, which means it was written in the 80s, and it was still, the era was still very 80s-ish, even though it was technically the 90s. And I forget about that. And I forget, like, the Cold War technically didn't end the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was in 91. So after this episode was written and aired. So I kind of forget about the that this is still of the 80s era, and of the Cold War was still a thing, is still going on. Especially in the 80s, it was quite huge. The whole Reagan-Gorbachev thing, I remember hearing all about that all the time when I was a little kid. So it's still relevant. I just never thought of that before. And of course, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, TNG would continue this analogy with the Romulans being a Cold War, such as in the episode Face of the Enemy, which came out in like 93 or 94 or whatever. But anyway, but this is, and so you hear about like Soviet defectors or U.S. defectors and stuff like that. So it seemed like a prime example to explore that concept, because you wouldn't think, even though you would think of it in terms of, contemporary modern times of Russian defectors, you would never think of a Romulan defector. It's just because the way these are actually, it's different because, Americans and Russians are still humans, whereas in Star Trek, these are totally different alien species, humans and Romulans. And so you never really think about it in the same terms, but it was interesting to have that analogy. And they do, in fact, in this episode, describe it as a really rare occurrence and something that doesn't really occur very often. Of course, speaking of Face of the Enemy, later that was in the 6th season, that would actually show the inverse of that, where it shows a human, a Federation citizen who defected to the Romulan Empire. Of course, I think they I wish they would have went in more detail with that. I think they kind of fast played that for the episode, which I didn't like, but I guess I'll talk about that eventually when I get to that episode. This one gives more sort of, but in that case, that was a human who actually wanted to live like a Romulan, and he liked the Romulan Empire and was he was sort of enthralled by it and intoxicated with it. Whereas in this case, Romulan doesn't really want to live in the Federation. He didn't defect to the Federation because he likes humans and thinks that the Starfleet is in the right and Romulan is in the wrong. He actually defects to Starfleet because he's against war and wants to prevent Romulus going to war with the Federation, because he thinks it would be harmful to Romulus, and that's his whole ethos, is that he's saying, I'm not doing this for you, I'm doing this to save the Romulan Star Empire. In this case, our interests just so happen to be more in line with the people who are currently running the Romulan Empire, which apparently were more hardliners, who were more warmongering and more towards war. Now, that, of course, is a very realistic and modern things that we can relate to in modern times, where a new government takes power or is in the hands of people who are more war-driven and more likely to start a war, which you can think of in pretty much any country where that happens a lot. And most often wars do start because of that, because a new group or new party takes power that just really wants war, and partly they come to power because they gain support from other people or the population who are more war driven, even though there are some in that same society who are against the war. So that's something that was really relatable, that made a lot of sense, that I could buy, that apparently a new group of Romulans took control that were more war-driven, and so this seasoned admiral who have committed atrocities against the Federation in the past, but what you would call war crimes of my people, call the Norfolk campaigns of my world. One world's villain is another's hero. That was a good line, too. I do like that. It shows the different perspectives of it. Anyway, it makes sense that this admiral, who, even though he has participated in fighting against the Federation before, would still be against an all-out war because he could see how devastating it would be for the Romulan people and how it would ultimately harm them. And to be fair, he's correct. But that is the position the Romulan Empire was always portrayed as before, is that they never really wanted an outright war themselves. They always toyed with the idea, but it was more of to be antagonistic towards the Federation, which again is very analogous to the Cold War, because the Romulans would know that any war would devastate them, and so really it wouldn't be in their interest. But what makes it believable that it could change their mind if, as I said, there were more hardliners that came into power, which is what he believes. However, as it turns out, even these hardliners are smart enough to not preemptively start a war. However, what they want to do is they want to trick the Federation into starting the war themselves, and so that, actually, because they don't want war, they want to show they want to have a victory against the Federation. Like Tom Locke said, he wanted to take the Enterprise broken hull back to Romulus to display the Romulan superiority and Romulan power, to scare everyone. And it wouldn't necessarily start a war, because we all know that the Federation and Starfleet would be too cowardly to start the war themselves, even if the Romulans destroyed the Enterprise, because legally they would have a right to, because the Enterprise crossed into the neutral zone where they're not supposed to go. So I don't think it would have started the war, to be fair, and I think the Romulans know this. They just wanted a victory against the Federation. And so it turns out that Zurok was wrong, that these hardliners weren't that crazy that they would be willing to start a war that would devastate Romulans. But apparently the hardliners gave that impression even before they tricked Zurok, because that's why Zurok started speaking out against him, and that's why they censured him, and that's why they tricked him, is because they knew that he was opposed to their more hardline position. So there obviously were more hardliners who were in control of the Romulan Empire, which is something really interesting. So the politics of this all is brilliant. It does make a lot of sense, and based off real life contemporary events, and using Cold War analogies. It's funny, Ronald D. Moore, who wrote this episode, or helped write this episode, apparently this episode was a group effort, that the original draft was quite different. In fact, I read an outline for the original pitch of this episode, and apparently in that pitch it was similar all the way up until the end, where in the end it was actually correct that the Romulans were playing the war in Picard, because he listened to Zurok, was able to stop them and win the day, and all was well. I think this ending's way better. I think it's a much better twist to have that Zurok was being deceived by the Romulans, being fed disinformation, rather than simply, Starfleet wins the day and they stop the war and everything's all good. But instead, this guy gave up his entire life, his entire family, because he was deceived, and so he ended up committing suicide. To me, that's a way more powerful ending. Also, in earlier drafts, they had a romance between Zurok and Crusher, which I think, it's an interesting concept, but unless you make this a two-parter, I don't think you have enough time to explore that. I think it was the right decision, because you need, in order to have, because that's a hard pitch, that Crusher would have a romance with with a Romulan defector, and of course that in that version, I guess, is he's not married. It was implied that he was, because he has children, and has stated here. But regardless of that, or he's a cheater, but whatever. But regardless of that, I think having a romance with Crusher is an interesting idea. I will be fair, but yeah, there's not enough time. It would detract from the main story of him being the defector, which I think the way that they ultimately did it was perfect, so that they take time away from it, then it becomes a bit watered down. And plus, I don't think you would have enough time to do the Crusher Jurok romance justice, unless, of course, as you say, as I said before, you make it a two-parter. If they made it a two-parter, then maybe they would have enough time to give both storylines their due, but I don't think they wanted to make it a two-parter, so it's a good thing that they 86 that storyline. But what makes this episode so great to me, and what I think really makes it stand out, is the personal story of Jurok. I think this episode does an amazing job, because it would be easy to have a defector and have him be like a two-dimensional character, and do you believe this, Romulan or not? But instead, and this is helped, of course, by the actor who does an amazing performance. Instead, they do a great job, pardon the term, humanizing Jurok and making him someone who is a complex character that you can really identify with and understand his motivations. And at one point, you really sympathize with this Romulan traitor. And I think one of the most brilliant scenes in the episode that really help convey this is the scene with him and Data in 10 Forward, which is absolutely an amazing scene. Part of the reason why I didn't really like that scene with the Klingon captain, Data, and 10 Forward in the chase, because it seems like they were doing this one, but much worse. Like, that scene was stupid when that Klingon tried to headbutt him. Anyway, this was a lot more powerful. That where Data, was curious about the Romulans, so engaged him in conversation. And the Romulan was pointing out how he, misses his daughter, misses his family, and Data's like, well, yeah, it does seem unlikely you'll ever get to return to Romulus in your lifetime. And the way he's just like, the cold response of an android. Like, and that whole interaction, I think, is absolutely brilliant and amazing. And of course, Data takes him to the holodeck to see Romulus, but then he realizes that he's just wallowing in the past and that he needs to deal with the future, and he gave up everything and he needs to make sure that it wasn't for nothing. And so he, admits to being Admiral Jurok, which doesn't seem like the right play to do, because immediately the Admiral is like, don't listen to anything he says, which is just so good that Picard is actually smarter and able to use his best judgment. And that's another absolutely brilliant scene, is the scene where Jurok goes into Picard's ready room after that, where Jurok continues to be this, like, look, I want to help you do this, but I won't betray my people. And I absolutely love Picard's speech where he's like, you already made a decision, you're a traitor. You've already betrayed your people. You're a traitor. Now you have to make peace with that. I love that. And Picard basically is just giving him like tough love and laying down the law. And but then Picard's like, well, what reason do I have to believe you? And then so Jurok starts talking about his kids. And Picard at first is very dismissive. He's like, yes, all very interesting. But he's like, I love the interaction. I love that scene, the way Jurok just holds up a hand. I'm like, no, this is serious. This is important. Hear me out. And so Picard lets him finish. And he talks about how seeing his little baby girl and seeing her and imagining her future and wanting the best for her, not wanting her to live, not wanting her to die or live in a war-torn society, and that the reason why he's doing it is for her, is convincing. And it doesn't just convince Picard, it convinces the audience, because I think the audience at this stage pretty much know that Jurok is being sincere. But Picard takes more convincing and saying, look, you betrayed your people. In order to convince us, you have to give us everything. Don't hold back anything. Tell us the defenses, the weaknesses of the Romulans, everything. And so he does. And they go play that dramatic music and they go to war. So it was a brilliant scene. Absolutely loved it. But there's a few issues I have. So Admiral Giroux does give them, Picard says he gives them ability to see through the cloaks of certain Romulan warbirds and gives them all this information on their technology that would help them. Yet none of that comes into play for the rest of the episode. Now for future episodes you can just assume that the Romulans upgraded their technology after this incident, although you could even assume that for this episode, since they knew that they wanted Giroux to be a traitor, that they might update their technology so that his intel wouldn't be as effective. However, you don't even see them trying to use it. I think that would be more interesting if the Enterprise, of course, was able to use his information to detect the warbirds or whatever, but then that would kind of go against the plot. And the other thing about this episode I kind of have an issue with is the Klingon aspect of it. It seems very plot conveniency, Deus Ex Machina, that the Klingons just so happen to show up and outnumber the Romulans. Now, I know that this was foreshadowed earlier, and some might think it's a little clever because they foreshadowed in a way to not give it away. They just had this one scene where Worf's like, "Oh, the Klingon vessel Bortos is hailing us," and Picard's like, "Oh yeah, go take care of that, Mr. Worf, who cares?" And so it's dismissed as a very insignificant thing, but then looking back on it, after you see the ending, you see that's them making the arrangement with the Klingons to come into the neutral zone with them. However, to be fair, like, this was the early third season. This was before they really had explored the Klingon Federation alliance. Because I think, if I recall, the only two real big Klingon episodes before this was the first season episode, Heart of Glory, which is pretty much retconned out of existence, and the second season episode of Matter of Honor, which is more closely representative of what they do with the Klingons in the future. So they didn't really get into some of the tensions that exist between the Klingon Federation alliance until later in the third season and in the fourth season, with episodes like Sins of the Father, Mind's Eye, Reunion, and all of that. But watching in retrospect, it seems out of place that the Klingons would just totally just be willing, without any sort of negotiations or repercussions, or just be willing to send 3 Klingon ships into the neutral zone, and they basically gain nothing out of it. And also, once the 3 ships are there, that they're willing to just simply hang out and not just like go crazy and attack the Romulans because they want to fight. I mean, you could buy it, but the fact that they don't really explore it or explain it, is just like one line of dialogue of Picard telling Worf to go talk to Klingon ship, and that's all you get, does seem a bit plot conveniency to me. Does seem a bit like a Deus Ex Machina, like, ha ha, this is how we defeat the Romulans. And of course, they have to have the Klingons' help when it comes to cloaking technology, because the Federation doesn't have cloaking technology. I don't know. I mean, I suppose the focus of the episode should be more on Giroux and his personal story, and I think it did an amazing job at that. So if they tried to explain this Klingon connection, it might have detracted from that. But it still seems like a Deus Ex Machina to me. Anywho, I guess another thing worth talking about in this episode, one that I also wasn't a fan of, was the opening with the Shakespeare Henry V thing and the holodeck. I didn't really like this scene, to be honest. And apparently they had originally written it as a Sherlock Holmes thing, but they were sued and they couldn't legally use Sherlock Holmes because they never got permission when they used him in season 2. And it wasn't until season 6 where they would finally be allowed to use them again. And so apparently it was Patrick Stewart himself, of course, Shakespearean actor, who suggested using Henry V. And it was okay, but I know they try to make the scene relevant later, and they do have, like, where Picard quotes it. I do like when he's having that talk with Tomalak towards the end of the episode, that he does do a callback to the Henry V thing, saying where Tomalak urges him not to let his crew die for no reason, where Picard's like, oh, but if the cause be just, and sort of calling back to that. So that I did like. But the scene itself, I don't like the fact that Patrick Stewart played one of the characters, the holodeck characters. That was confusing, having Picard and Patrick Stewart playing a holodeck character there. Apparently, it was just Patrick Stewart really, really wanting to do Shakespeare. But really, if they were going to do that, then they should have had Riker or someone else, or Troy, and not Picard there. It just doesn't make sense to have two versions of Patrick Stewart in the same scene. So that I didn't like that, and I also didn't like, I don't know, I just thought it was kind of like Data trying to do the, hide the thing. I don't know. It seemed, I know they do callbacks to it later in the episode, but it seemed mostly irrelevant. I just didn't care for it. But that's just me. Anyway, my rating for the Defector out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. Very nearly gave this episode a 10, but I think it's not quite there. It's not quite to 10-ness, but it is damn good. It's a damn good episode, and it's so good because it explored the character of Yurok, and the actor did an amazing performance as Yurok, and it really humanizes him. It really gets you in his mindset, and the moment where he commits suicide at the end of the episode was so fucking powerful, especially Picard's thing about perhaps there'll be a time where there will be peace between the Romulans and the Federation, and we can take his letter home. Like, that's touching shit. It's really great. Little does he know that the Romulan Empire is going to be wiped out by a supernova, but whatever. But damn, that was just such a good episode. So that's it for my review of The Defector. Thank you so much to all my Patreons who support me. It's very, very much appreciated, and so I do enjoy doing these Patreon user polls for you guys. And thanks to you for everyone who supports the channel, and just by watching, clicking like, and leaving a comment, and just supporting my channel by watching my videos. It's also very much appreciated. So I shall return with more Star Trek reviews, and also covering other shows like The Expanse, Star Wars Clone Wars, and Better Call Saul. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.